So for this video, we're going to actually create a Neon branch for every Amplify app branch that is created through our Git repository. So we're going to jump into the Amplify CICD process in the build settings, and then also link up our Neon account through the API key from Neon. And that way, through CICD, we can leverage the Neon CLI and actually create a branch for a new environment or branch in Amplify. And then after build, we can go through and clean up stale branches in the database if needed. So this will hopefully help you automate your workflow a bit, especially if you're using Neon Postgres as a relational database for your Amplify app. Specifically, we're going to look at a scenario where I'm using a Nuxt app with SSR. This is taking advantage of Amplify Hosting web compute. So there is this server-side compute element that would be able to connect to a database. So we'll take a look at that. And then in a future video, I'll actually show how to connect to your database branch using the serverless driver from Neon. So let's jump in. If you're not already familiar, Neon is serverless Postgres. So at the click of a button, you get a full Postgres cluster stood up in the cloud that you can connect to just using a URL. With this, you can have auto scaling. You also have database branching or cluster branching, which will copy over your entire Postgres cluster into a new branch that you can leverage in an isolated way. And AWS Amplify is a service that allows you to build and deploy full stack serverless apps. Part of that service is Amplify Hosting, and that's where you can host static apps, single page apps, or in the case of our example today, SSR based apps. So that's what we're going to dig into. Okay, so we're going to create an Amplify app, and then for each branch of this Amplify app, we're going to auto create a database branch. So specifically, we're going to use Neon Postgres as the relational database. And then within the Amplify CICD, on each build, a branch is going to be created if one doesn't already exist for the Amplify branch. And then post build, the process will go through and clean up any Neon branches that are left over. So what that means is we don't have database branches that are pretty much just hanging out if the feature branch, for instance, has already been removed from the Amplify app. What this will do is just allow you to isolate your data a bit better. Branching in Neon is super quick. It will take less than a second to create a copy of your database cluster. And then the process in CI/CD will actually return back a connection string. That connection string will be included into an environment variable within your runtime compute. In this case, I'll show you an app that is a Nuxt app. It's using the web compute portion of Amplify Hosting. So you need that environment variable to run server side so that you can actually access your database in API routes or server routes in the case of Nuxt. So we won't jump too far into the Nuxt app today. We'll look more at the CI/CD, and these resources will be available in a GitHub repo. So you can kind of go in, tweak, and modify as needed, and just give you a gist of, what's needed to do something like this. But really, all of this is made possible leveraging an API key from your Neon account, and then using that API key within this build script or bash script within the build script that calls the Neon CLI. So we'll take a look at that as well. So I'm already in Amplify Hosting here. This is the Gen 2 kind of look and feel. I'm going to use this so that you get a feel for, where everything is at when we're configuring the setup. But just keep in mind that this should work for just, Amplify Hosting, pre-Gen 2. But as the platform evolves a bit, this will become more of the norm. So I already have an app in GitHub. You can use one of these other providers as well. But in this case, I'm going to jump over to GitHub. This should already authenticate here. And let me see. I've got this Nuxt Neon Amplify. And I'm going to select, I do have some branches here already. I'm going to select main and then jump through and show you this. So for SSR in this case with Nuxt, you'll notice that the build directory is Amplify Hosting. This is a little bit different from kind of the traditional CI/CD for Amplify. So just keep that in mind. Can always be tweaked later on. And also the service role is going to be auto created for this because it is SSR based. It needs a service role, especially if you want to have your server side logs go over to CloudWatch. So I'm going to leave that there. And then for the advanced settings, this is super important. Make sure you jump down and select Amazon Linux 2023. So that's the newest build image that's available. Environment variables we're going to skip, and then live package updates we're also going to skip. Now, I'm going to click this and go through as it deploys the first pass. So just verify all this, and it will likely fail, and we'll talk about why, just because of the configuration. But Amplify Hosting does have a concept of environment secrets and environment variables, and you can leverage both of those in a similar fashion as to how I'm using parameter store, and I'll show you that. I think parameter store is very convenient for using and reusing parameters across different apps. So if you don't want to do that, you can definitely leverage Amplify Hosting's way to store secrets via a namespace with your app ID, and that's in the documentation. And it can also be used within CICD. That's a possibility. I like to a lot of times just call out to parameter store and then grab the parameter that I want to specify. So that's how I have this set up. So I think that's very convenient and flexible. So yeah, there are a couple different ways you can go into hosting and app settings as well to configure that if you want to have secrets. But if you're using like an Amplify, I don't know, we'll say like a backend, and then you're using Amplify Hosting, and then maybe you're using another service as well, and they all need to share an API key, you could potentially just keep that in one parameter and parameter store instead of paying for multiple parameters or secrets and secrets manager. So we'll wait for this to finish up. And actually, I'm just going to jump in here so you can see what it looks like. And this should be going through. Okay. Now, as this is deploying, you'll see here that we've got a couple pipeline scripts. I'm going to jump over to the Amplify build settings and actually show what's happening. And then we're going to come back and update our application so that it takes advantage of this. I've checked in this Amplify YAML file into the repo. This is the repo of the app that is being deployed. And this should look very familiar. If you're using Amplify Gen 2, you'll notice that there is this Amplify pipeline deploy here. I'm using pnpm as well, so that's a little bit different. So you might have a couple extra commands here. But really what's happening is in the backend phase or backend portion, I've got a couple pre-build commands where I'm installing a JQ. That's just going to help parse out some of the responses from the API and CLI. And then I'm installing the Neon CLI as well globally. Then in the build command, I'm going to generate the required configuration for Amplify. So this is pretty much saying that, do I want to reuse my backend configuration for my main or dev branch or else? So you can tweak that. This is auto-generated. If you're using an Amplify Gen 2 backend, this will automatically be there once you deploy. But then I'm calling this script here, this Neon CI, and this is taking in different parameters here. So you'll see like app ID, it's passing in my Amplify app ID, Neon project ID. This is actually from my Neon account. Branch name, which equates to my Amplify branch, parent branch, which is the database, API key param, which is my SSM or parameter store reference to my parameter, and then some other information here as well. So this script goes through, it generates my Amplify config, and then it actually creates a branch using my Amplify branch name and app ID, and then uses my Neon account to create a branch there. So that's on the database side. And then post build, what happens is the script runs and cleans up any branches that are left over. If there aren't Amplify app branches that match Neon branches, it will clean that up too. And then this just goes through and deploys. So this is the Amplify YAML. The CI itself or the bash script is just that. So you can jump through and you'll see that it just takes these parameters and then does some logic checking, and then goes through and actually calls parameter store in this case to get your API key, and then also calls the Neon CLI that was installed before. So there are some dependencies in the Amplify CICD runtime, like you want to make sure that the Neon CLI is there so this runs correctly, but you can jump through and take a look at what the logic is and then adjust as needed. Let me jump back. So this deployment failed, and for a couple reasons. So it says Neon API key is not set. Well, first thing is the service role that was created for this application actually doesn't have access in this scenario to the parameter store parameter. So it can't get the API key in this build setting. So that's one thing that we have to do. And then second, we want to set up the branch auto detection feature. So we're going to do that first and then go and adjust the permissions. So we need to go in and update the role so it has the correct permissions to access the API key and parameter store. And then also call listBranches from the AWS CLI for Amplify. That way we can get all the Amplify branches. So that's the first thing. And then subsequently, we also need to enable the branch auto detection in the repo. So let me do that first. I'm going to jump down to repository settings here. And this will just verify. And then you see that branch auto detection is off. I'm going to go in and I'm actually going to auto connect. This is just going to grab pretty much any branch that comes through and create an Amplify branch for that. So if there's a Git branch created, it's going to catch that and then create an Amplify branch. What we're going to do is when each of these new branches is created, we're also going to create a Neon branch of the database to pair with each of these branches, right? So we've got the Git branch that comes in, and then that branch creates a new Amplify branch automatically. And then through CICD, we catch that new branch and we actually create a Neon branch. That way, all these things are aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now that is created. And now I need to go in and actually update the service role. So you'll see here that the service role that was created is this Amplify SSR logging role. And this is just because I used the auto created one. So I'm going to grab that and then actually jump into IAM and go into roles and find this role. You'll see that it's here. So now I have this. This was created 40 minutes ago. And now I need to adjust it. So I'm going to add a permission here and then create inline policy. And once again, we need to allow this role to access a parameter store for the parameter, and then also the listBranches action for AWS Amplify. So I'm going to go into the JSON editor. And over here in the repo, I actually have these statements already. So I'm just going to grab this statement, which is for Amplify. And then you see here, I'm going to pop this in. And then I'm going to grab the one for parameter store, pop this in. Like so. Make it nice. Yeah, awesome. Okay. So what this does is this is going to allow this role to call Amplify listBranches on this resource. So you'll see that the resource actually does have a couple wildcards here. This is pretty much saying that for apps created by Amplify, the role is allowed to grab their list functionality of branches essentially. So this is pretty much like any app in any region for Amplify for this role. Now, and it's for any region for parameter store. This is going to allow get parameters by path, get parameters, and get parameter. So pretty much the hierarchy of being able to call get parameters. And specifically, this is going to look for any account, ID in there, any region, and then the name of the parameter is Neon API or API-key. So I've already saved that in parameter store as a secure string. That's also in the repo. So what that means is I create a new parameter in parameter store and I select a secure string. And then whenever I grab that using the AWS CLI, it actually grabs it with decryption so that it grabs the actual value in my CICD build. So I'm going to save this here. And then the policy name, I'm just going to create Amplify Neon CICD. Cool. And you can see it right here. Now we're good to go. So now I'm going to jump back over to Amplify. And this is failed, but now I've got auto detection set up for the branches. And now I have the access to the API key and list branch functionality. So let's give it a go. So I'm going to jump back into this app here and I'm going to deploy. All right, while this is deploying, let's jump back over to the Neon console. This is where if you haven't created an API key yet, you're going to want to do that. And you should have done that to make this work in CICD because you have to save that in parameter store. So that's in your account profile up to the top right. But right now we're looking at branches. So this is the main branch for my Neon database cluster here. So this project Neon Amplify CICD. And you just saw that a new branch popped up here. So this is the main branch for my Amplify app. So we kicked off a build, it went through the CICD, and then actually a new branch was created for that app, and that's under main. Now, you'll notice that I've got my parent branch, which is primary here, and then I've got my app branch here for the environment. You can kind of change how this works. If you don't want to do a duplicate main branch, you can just leverage the existing main branch. So you can jump into the Amplify CI/CD build settings and adjust that and the CI/CD script, the bash script. That's all fine. This is just to provide an example of what you can do if you want to automate the branch creation. So that went through, it created the branch. You'll notice here that this identifier here is actually the identifier of my Amplify app. So if I jump back to my Amplify app, it should have D2PIE. And I look here and you'll see up here, I have D2PIU. So that's my identifier here. And now what I want to do is I want to create another branch for my Amplify app and just show how a Neon branch will automatically be created as well. So let me jump over to just the main app here. You see I've got one branch, and I'm going to go into my terminal, check out another branch, which will be a Neon Amplify, just do ABC, create that, push this. Okay, so this is going to push, and then that will automatically get picked up from Git in Amplify. So I jump back over, and now it's building this this branch here. So that's the branch auto detection. So that is associated with my Git repo. So if I'm using GitLab, Bitbucket, code commit, or in this case, GitHub, you can do that with Amplify. Now it's going to pull over the associated code for that and create a database branch. And then once that database branch is created, it's going to take the connection string. So it's going to make another call to the Neon API. It's going to grab the connection string and then put that into an environment variable. Let's go back to the Neon console to see what happens for the second branch, looking at Neon Amplify ABC. So we should see the branch pop up here in a second. And there we go. So we've got two branches here. We've got the main branch, and now we have this, you'll see there in the hover, Neon Amplify ABC, which is associated with this second branch, and that's going to finish deploying here in a minute. So while that's actually finishing deploy, we'll jump in and look at the apps and show how this translates actually into the data being served from the database. So if I go back to just the top level app here, and I click on the app URL, this is, in this case, already going to log me in. I'm using Amplify Auth that has Cognito, so I've actually logged in already, and I have my ID here. But I'm going to jump into a server route, and what that is in Nuxt is an API route. So I'm going to go API and then hit shows, and this shows endpoint is actually going to return data from the database. So I'm going to do that. You can see that I've got Netflix data here. I'm just returning a few records. But also I've got this identifier here from my connection string, and I'm just definitely take this out in production. This is just to illustrate data is coming from a specific branch. So if I look here, it says EP Crimson Sound, and then I go back into my Neon console here, and I'm going to jump into this main branch, and I can see that the identifier is EP Crimson Sound, right? So I've got this compute endpoint here that is associated with this database branch, and then that database branch is used in my branch in Amplify. So I've got this one-to-one between Amplify branch and then database branch. Okay. So now let me just go back here, and then this should have deployed here. So this Neon Amplify ABC. I'm going to click on this URL now, and you see I've got two URLs here. This is going to make me log in. Okay, so I've logged in, same screen. I'm actually using the same Amplify Auth just across these environments. And let me go now to this endpoint. So I'm going to go to API and then shows. So same code for the application, except now the connection string is different for this environment. So I'm going to go here, and you can see same data is returned. It says EP square truth up here. Let me just highlight that. And now let me go back to my Neon console, and I'm going to look at this second branch here, and I'm going to click there, and I see EP square truth. So pulling these side by side. So actually, if I do, I'm just going to bring this down. You'll see here that in both of these, data is returned the same, but it's coming from a different database branch, and then that's associated with a different top-level domain here or endpoint. So it's a pretty cool way to isolate these databases between environments, and that way your data, from prod, dev, and test can stay separated. Also, if you're just working on feature branches, this is a good way to give developers a way to actually test. If you wanted to, you could also jump into the Amplify CICD and actually run migrations. So depending on, if you're using an ORM like Drizzle or Prisma, you can run your migrations at that point too. So maybe you have migrations in your feature branch. So you want to create a new branch from your parent branch in Neon and then run the migrations against that database branch. You can do that and actually test what will happen in that case. So that's definitely nice. And then, you're not accidentally applying destructive changes to your database. So that's one nice thing. The second thing is there is some branch cleanup in this Neon CICD bash script. You can adjust that as needed. You cannot use that. It's just there as an example. One thing to keep in mind just in Amplify hosting is that if you create multiple apps from the same Git repo, every time you push to that Git repo, it's going to trigger builds across those multiple apps. So you don't want to be kind of like blowing away database branches if, one app is doing one thing and another app is doing something else, but they're connected to the same Git repo. So definitely keep that in mind. There is a caveat in the Git repo for the Neon shell script, just so you're aware of that. And then the last thing is, in a future video, we'll actually jump into this app and show what it looks like to work within a Nuxt SSR app and grab that connection string from the environment variable and then serve the data through an endpoint. So really bringing it all together. Awesome. Well, I hope that gave a good overview of how to create a different database branch for each Amplify app branch. This is taking into account the Amplify Hosting CICD and connecting to GitHub, but then also, leveraging Neon database branching, and especially database branching that happens, within a second, being able to copy over your entire database cluster essentially into a new branch and then leverage that within your application environments. Cool. Have fun.